The ancient Egyptians did not fear death the way most people do today. They did not fear it as a sudden ending. They did not fear it as darkness. They did not fear it as punishment. They feared something worse. They feared dying wrong, not because the gods were cruel, but because the afterlife was not automatic. In ancient Egypt, death was not a door that simply opened. It was a transition that could fail, a sequence of steps, gates, protections, and procedures that had to be followed, or the soul would not continue. And if the soul failed to continue, it did not burn forever. It disappeared. The Egyptians called it the second death, the end of return, the end of memory, the end of being reachable, a silence so complete it was as if you had never existed. That is why rituals mattered, because rituals were not traditions. They were survival technology. Modern people often imagine ancient rituals as superstition. They picture priests repeating strange words, chanting into smoke, performing ceremonies because they believed the gods demanded drama. But Egyptians were not performing rituals for spectacle. They were building structure. They believed the universe survived on Mayat, the principle of order, balance, truth, and continuity. And Mayat was not guaranteed. Chaos was always present, always waiting. Every day, order had to be maintained again. Every night, the sun itself had to survive the Duat. So death, to the Egyptians, was not peaceful. It was dangerous, because death removed your anchors. It removed the body as a stable center. It removed breath, warmth, motion. It removed the daily rhythm that kept identity intact. And without anchors, the soul could scatter. In Egyptian belief, a person was not a single thing. A person was a system, a configuration of parts that had to remain aligned. The Ka, the life force, sustained by offerings. The Ba, the mobile essence, able to move between worlds. The Name, the anchor of identity, keeping you reachable. And the Ak, the final integrated form, achieved only if the soul survived judgment and remained coherent. Death threatened this system immediately. It threatened to break it into pieces. And rituals existed to prevent that break. Without the right rituals, the Ka could weaken, the Ba could drift, the Name could fade, and the Ak could never form, meaning the dead would not truly live beyond death. They would become unstable, then unreachable, then erased. This is why Egyptians built tombs like machines. The tomb was not simply a resting place. It was infrastructure, a controlled environment designed to preserve identity. Walls were inscribed with spells, names, offerings, and protection texts, not because they wanted decoration, because they believed writing could stabilize reality. Words were not just words. Words were tools. A correctly spoken name could hold a soul in place. A correctly written spell could open passage. A correctly placed symbol could block chaos. And the fear behind all of it was simple. If you die without protection, the underworld will not pause for you. The Duat was not heaven. It was not hell. It was a maze. A sequence of thresholds, gates, darkness, rivers, and interrogations. A realm where the dead soul needed correct recognition to move forward. Names of gates, names of guardians, correct formulas. In modern terms, it was a password system. And a soul that died without rituals would arrive unprepared. It would not know what to say. It would not know who to name. It would hesitate. And hesitation was fatal, because hesitation led to stopping. And stopping in the Duat led to collapse. Not immediately, but inevitably, like a flame losing oxygen. Slowly, quietly, until nothing remained. Egyptians feared dying without rituals because the soul needed momentum. Movement through the underworld was survival. If you moved, you maintained coherence. If you stopped, the parts of you began to separate. The Ba drifting away like smoke, the Ka weakening without sustenance, the Name losing connection without remembrance. And the worst part was not pain. It was the fading, the disappearing, the sense that you were becoming less and less real, until you were no longer a person, only silence. This is where the role of priests becomes clearer. priests were not simply religious officials. They were technicians of continuity. They performed rituals not to entertain gods, but to ensure the dead could pass the system. They purified the body. They spoke the name. They invoked protection. They did what had to be done so the dead could remain intact long enough to reach judgment, because judgment was not guaranteed. You had to survive the maze first, and that brings us to the most famous ritual of all, mummification. Modern people think Egyptians mummified the body because they worshipped the corpse, but the Egyptians preserved bodies because the body was an anchor. The body was the fixed reference point for the soul's identity. Without a preserved body, the soul could lose its center, and if the soul lost its center, it became easier for chaos to fragment it. So the body was prepared with extreme precision, dried with natron, sealed with resin, wrapped with linen, protected with amulets. Every step had meaning, not aesthetic meaning, structural meaning, a declaration that this identity must not collapse. And still, the Egyptians did not believe mummification alone was enough, because the underworld was not impressed by effort. It responded to precision. So rituals multiplied. Offerings, spells, names repeated endlessly, because repetition reinforced stability. And stability was the only defense against the oldest enemy in Egyptian thought: chaos. Not chaos as chaos in movies. Chaos as the silent force that dissolves patterns, the force that turns structure into dust, the force that makes identity fade, the force that erases. To understand why Egyptians feared dying without rituals, you have to understand their deepest horror: being forgotten. Not emotionally, structurally. In ancient Egypt, memory was not a feeling, it was a mechanism. To be remembered meant you remained reachable. To be forgotten meant your existence began to weaken, because the Egyptian afterlife depended on connection between worlds. The living could feed the dead. The living could speak the name. The living could maintain continuity. But none of that worked if the dead soul had already started collapsing, and dying without rituals was the fastest way to collapse. The Egyptians believed the soul needed support immediately after death. Not later, immediately. The moment the last breath ended, the system began to loosen. The body became silent. The eyes stopped seeing. The mouth stopped speaking. And in Egyptian belief, the dead soul did not wake up in a peaceful place. It woke up in vulnerability. It woke up in transition, a state where the pieces of identity could separate. This is why the opening rituals were so important. They were the first reinforcements. They were designed to prevent scattering. Think of the Egyptian soul like a structure held together by tension. When life is present, everything is tight. When life ends, everything slackens. Without ritual, there is nothing to tighten the structure again. So the Ka weakens. The Ka is the life force. It needs nourishment. Offerings were not symbolic in Egypt. They were fuel: bread, beer, water, incense. Without offerings, the Ka thins. It becomes fragile. And a fragile Ka cannot support the rest. The Ba is the mobile essence, often depicted as a human-headed bird. The Ba is what moves. It travels, it returns. But a Ba without stability becomes aimless. A Ba without an anchor becomes drift. And drift is dangerous, because drift leads to disorientation. And disorientation in the Duat is fatal. The Duat is not forgiving. It does not guide you gently. It expects precision. This is why names matter so much. The Egyptians believed the name was a key, not a label. A key. Your name held your identity inside reality. It allowed recognition. It allowed the dead to remain reachable. And the name required repetition. It had to be carved. It had to be spoken. It had to be remembered. A person whose name was erased from stone was not only dishonored, they were destabilized, because the connection to remembrance was breaking. So what happens if someone dies without rituals? The Egyptians believed the soul enters the transition unreinforced. No protective sealing, no spoken name, no spells to stabilize speech, no amulets to block fragmentation. The soul moves forward without equipment. and the underworld is not kind to unarmed souls. The Duat is filled with gates, and gates do not open because you are sincere. They open because you are correct. Every gate had a name. Every guardian had a name. To know the name was to assert recognition. To assert recognition was to assert control. A soul that died without rituals might not know any of this. It might arrive in the Duat with silence, with hesitation. And hesitation, in Egyptian belief, was more dangerous than fear, because hesitation stops motion. Motion is what keeps identity coherent. The Egyptians believed that survival after death required movement. Movement through gates, through darkness, through the night hours, because the longer you remained still inside the Duat, the more unstable you became. A soul that stops begins to fade. Not dramatically, quietly, like ink dissolving in water, like a flame shrinking when the air is pulled away. That fading is the nightmare behind dying without rituals, because fading means the soul becomes less able to function, less able to speak, less able to remember, less able to name itself. And in the Egyptian afterlife, speech is not expression. Speech is function. Speech opens passage. Speech protects identity. Speech declares alignment. Without speech, the soul cannot proceed. This is why one of the most important ritual ideas in Egypt was restoring the dead's ability to speak. There were spells meant to keep the mouth open, to keep the tongue active, to prevent silence from consuming the person, because silence was not peace. Silence was failure. A soul that could not speak could not answer gates, could not defend itself, could not assert names, could not maintain coherence. It would become trapped. And trapped meant dissolving. Now we arrive at the terrifying center of Egyptian belief, judgment. But judgment was not the first thing. Judgment came later, after the gates, after the maze, after the night journey. Only those who remained coherent reached the Hall of Two Truths. And that hall was a place built for one purpose: measurement. Not empathy, not negotiation, not persuasion, measurement. Anubis stood beside the scale. He was not the judge in the modern sense. He was the verifier. He ensured the scale was exact. He ensured the procedure was clean. Because in Egypt, the afterlife depended on accuracy, and then the heart was placed on one side, the feather of Maat on the other. The feather represented cosmic balance, the minimum standard of order, and the heart represented what the person carried, not what they claimed, what they carried. A soul that died without rituals arrived at judgment weaker, more fragmented, more vulnerable, because the journey itself erodes stability. The Duat strains identity. It exhausts memory. It creates pressure. And without ritual reinforcement, the soul becomes easier to collapse. Not because it was evil, because it was unsupported. This is crucial. The Egyptian afterlife is terrifying because it suggests failure is not always moral. Failure can be mechanical. A soul can fail because it lacked structure, because it lacked preparation, because it died without the protections that held identity together. This is why Egyptians feared unburied bodies. A person lost in the desert, a person swallowed by the river, a person taken by war, not because they feared death itself, but because they feared a death without ritual, a death without anchoring, a death without equipment, a death that began the fading immediately. And this is why funerary rituals were treated like emergency procedures. They were not nice traditions. They were survival steps. They protected the dead long enough to reach the scale intact, because the scale measured weight. And weight was not only moral. Weight could be the result of collapse, fragmentation, and instability. A heavy heart could be disorder, but disorder could come from life, or from unprotected death. And if the heart was heavier than the feather, the soul did not suffer forever. It was erased, the second death. And that is why rituals mattered, because rituals did not guarantee reward. They reduced risk. They kept the soul coherent long enough to continue. They held the person together against chaos. The Egyptians did not fear dying. They feared dissolving, because in their world, death was not a single event. It was a transition that could succeed or fail, and failure did not mean pain. It meant disappearance, the second death, the end of return, a silence so complete that even memory could no longer reach you. No offerings could feed you, no prayers could touch you, no name could land anywhere. You would not be punished. You would be removed, as if you were never stable enough to exist beyond the body at all. That is why rituals were everything, because rituals were not superstition, they were structure. They were the architecture that held a soul together after the body stopped working. Mummification preserved the anchor. Spells preserved speech. Offerings sustained the ka. Names preserved recognition. Symbols blocked fragmentation. Each ritual was a reinforcement, a barrier between identity and collapse, a shield against chaos. Because Egypt believed chaos was always present, not only in the desert storms, not only in the dark waters, in the invisible pressure that pulls patterns apart, the force that turns structure into dust. This is why the Egyptian afterlife was not a fantasy world of endless comfort. It was a system, a maze of gates and thresholds, a journey where movement kept you coherent and hesitation could break you, a final hall where the universe did not listen to your story. It measured your weight. The feather of Mayat did not change. The scale did not bend, and if the heart was too heavy, there was no argument, only consequence. Erasure. So, what happened to those who died without rituals? The Egyptians believed they entered the transition unsupported. They arrived without reinforcement, without protection, without the tools needed to remain intact. Their identity weakened faster. Their memory failed sooner. Their speech broke more easily. They could stop in the Duat, and stopping meant fading, until the soul could no longer move, no longer respond, no longer hold form, until nothing remained. Not even suffering, only absence. And that is the darkest truth beneath Egyptian funerary tradition. The rituals were not meant to impress the gods. They were meant to keep the dead from collapsing before the gods even mattered. Because the Egyptians believed survival after death required engineering. Not hope, not belief alone. Engineering, a system built to preserve continuity, to defeat the one enemy Egypt knew could never truly be destroyed: chaos. That is why they carved names into stone. That is why they filled tombs with spells. That is why they wrapped bodies for weeks. That is why they repeated rituals generation after generation. Because they were not trying to avoid death. They were trying to avoid being erased, trying to remain present, trying to remain reachable, trying to remain real. In the end, the Egyptian fear was simple. Not that you would die, but that you would die and never continue. That your name would fade, your soul would scatter, and the universe would move forward without you as if you had never existed. That is what dying without rituals meant. Not death, but collapse. And in Egypt, collapse was the only true horror.